Welcome to the MSJC Internet Authoring Videocast.
In this guided practice video, you'll be learning how to create and use arrays in your Java programs. So just a brief recap of what you learned in the lecture about arrays. They are complex or reference types. So they're not primitive types like your ints and your booleans and your doubles and your floats. They're complex or reference types, and those two words are interchangeable. The reason they're referred to as a reference type is because instead of putting the value of the variable onto the stack like you have with your primitive type, what actually gets stored on the stack is called a reference, which is a pointer or a memory address to where the information for the array is actually being stored, which is on the heap. And so that's just an explanation so that you can understand the difference between a primitive and a complex type. Now there's a couple of ways that we can go about creating our arrays. To start with, we could just use literals. So say for instance we want to create a collection of cars. An array is a way of creating a collection of items, a list of items. And so in defining the array, we have to identify what the type of items are that we're going to store into it. So in this case, I'm going to use string as the type. So we're going to put strings. It'll be a list of strings, a collection of strings that we'll be creating here. So that's the first part of declaring the array. But the important part here is that we use the two brackets. That's what really designates that we're telling the Java virtual machine we want to create an array. So at this point we're saying we want to create an array of strings, and then just simply assign a name to it. We'll go ahead and use cars in this case. So then we'll put in the assignment operator and a set of curly braces, and inside of the curly braces now we'll list the string values that we want to be stored in our cars array. So we'll just come up with some different brand names here, and then each one is going to be separated by a comma. And then we end this as we normally would, as a statement with a semicolon. So we have four different manufacturers' names there, cars, names of cars, actual manufacturers of cars, I guess you could say. So Volvo, Ford, Chrysler, and BMW. So that is a initialized array, initialized with the actual literals that we want to store in the array. We could do this with ints too. Let's try ints. It's going to be an array, and we'll just call it numbers. And again, we'll use the curly braces so that we can put the literals inside of the curly braces, and then separate each value by a comma, like so. Okay, so two initialized arrays. First one called cars. It has a list of four different manufacturers of cars, Volvo, Ford, Chrysler, and BMW. And then the second one is called numbers, and it has the values of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So again, the key is that we identified the type first, what we're going to store in the array, and then indicated we want to create an array. So that's telling the Java virtual machine that we're going to put all this information onto the heap. In fact, what actually happens, as I said earlier, the stack will contain, when you reference cars, it's actually going to go look at the stack where cars is identified in your program, and it's going to have the address for the very beginning, the very first element, the first piece of information that is stored in your array. So in the cars array, Volvo is the first piece of information. So that's the cars address actually points to that location, the beginning of the array, which is where Volvo is located. And the arrays are stored contiguously in memory. And so once we have the starting point of the array, then we can find each of the additional elements in the array as well. And when I say we, I'm referring to the Java virtual machine. So now to access the contents of these arrays, what we can do is actually just write the array name. So let's start with cars and then follow it with square brackets. And inside of the square brackets, we type an index value. So that index value is how we identify which of the items in the array we want to display. So if I type in the number 1, you might think, oh, well, that's going to give me Volvo. But it's not correct, because computers, in the world of computers, everything starts with a 0, or at the point of 0, because it's binary. And so the same is true with the array. The first index in any array is going to be the 0 index. So let's go ahead and prove this point here. We'll go ahead and run this and show you that it is Ford is the value that is output there, because we start at 0, so Volvo is 0 index. Ford is at the 1 index in the array. So Volvo is the 0 element, Ford is the number 1 element, Chrysler is the number 2 element, and BMW is the number 3 element. So that's very important to understand about arrays, that they always begin at 0. And just to verify that, we could put in 0 now as the index that we want to display as our output, run it again, and there we do get Volvo for the output. Let's try it with numbers. So number 0 should be the very first element, correct? So number 10 should be our output, and it is. If we put in, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, we should get 40. Run it, and there we go, we get 40. So hopefully you understand that relationship between the element number, which is referred to when we're using this syntax here, where we're identifying the name of the array and then the specific element we want to view. That value is actually called the index value. Within the array itself, each of these items is referred to as an element. So Volvo is an element, Ford is an element, Chrysler is an element, BMW is an element. Same with numbers. 10 is an element, 20 is an element, 30 is an element. But it's the reference, the way that we reference those elements within the array, that's referred to as the index value. So now let's move on from this concept and show you that you could create an array of ints by simply doing this. So we've declared an array of integers, but we haven't assigned anything to it. So what happens here is that the Java virtual machine will actually just put null as the value in the stack for the array. So array right now, the reference for it is the value of null. Now we could just take this a little bit further here and go ahead and assign it using the new operator and say we want to have a new array of integers, and we want to have 10 elements in that new element, that new array. So in this case here, you can see on the right side after the assignment operator, we use the new keyword. So that's going to create an actual array for us now on the heap. It'll be of type integers, and we've specified then how many elements we want to have in this array, which is 10. So we'll have 10 elements created. There's 10 placeholders. If you remember, integers are going to be 4 bytes, so we would have 40 bytes now reserved on the heap for this new array that we're calling array. And because it's integers, by default, those are going to be 0 values, so we can show you that. If we print out any one of the indexes for that array, so let's just type in array, and then in the square brackets, the first index. I shouldn't say the first, the number 1 index. So if we want to do the first, it's going to be 0, right? So let's go there. The only thing is, well, we'll just go ahead and run it. Just show you that because it's an integer, the value is going to be 0 at the first index. and all of the elements will be a value of 0 because that's just the default for integers, right? So even if we put 1 in here, you can see we still get 0. So the point is that on the heap, the memory has been reserved. There's a 0 being assigned as the default value then for each of the 10 integers in this array. So take this a little bit further. Let's now generate a new random object. We'll call it R. And then we'll create a for loop where we start I at 0, and we're going to increment this for loop as long as we're less than the array's length. So that's one of the nice things about having an object like an array. It has a property of length, and so that automatically or dynamically will tell us, or tell the program, how many elements are in that array. So we don't necessarily have to know in advance the actual number. As long as we use that particular property, whatever the length of the array is, that is dynamically known to the system. Looks like I missed my parentheses here, didn't I? Okay, so then inside of the for loop, we'll just take the array, and at whatever the current value of I is, and we're starting at 0, so that would be at the first element in our array, we will assign to it a random number. So we'll use our random number object R, and we'll go with next int, and we'll put in 100 there, so it'll be the range there will be 0 to 99. So each time through the loop now, a random number is going to be generated and placed into the elements of the array in order from 0 through 9 as far as the element array indexes are concerned. To be able to display that output, we're going to need to have another for loop. Again, we'll start with int of I equal to 0, and again we'll run it as long as we're less than our array length. And then we'll just do a system out here where we display the array value based on whatever the current value of I is each time through the for loop. Forgot to put I in there, didn't I? So I less than array length. So initially we create the array in the for loop by randomly generating a value each time through the loop and assigning it to the current element. And then we basically use the same format in a for loop now to print to the screen what values are being randomly generated and stored in our array. So let's go ahead and run this. And you can see there's our randomly generated values. We'll run it again just to prove that they are randomly generated. And if you count them there, you'll see that we do have 10 different numbers being generated each time. Now let's go ahead and combine this with our last lesson, which was methods. So what we'll do then is go outside of our main method, because we're going to create a custom method now. We're going to call it, let's see, it'll be public, and it's going to return an int array, and we're going to call it create array, and then it's going to take an int parameter that we're going to call and use as size. So what we can do now is we can take all of this that we created here, cut it out and put it in our method, and then the only thing we need to do is just add that we want to return array as the result. Okay, so we just created the header here. We've identified its access modifier as public. We've identified that the return type is going to be an integer array. We named it create array, and we passed a parameter of integer type that we're calling size. And so size we're going to use now here internally. Instead of a fixed value of 10 when we declare the array, we want to use the size variable, so that way we can generate varying sizes of arrays using the create array method. And then it's going to just simply do as it did before, or what we had created before, that we're going to just randomly generate a value and store it into the array regardless of the size here. Because remember, the key is that this length property dynamically evaluates the array in the number of elements in there, and it knows what the length is. So we can create an array now of any size and always get an array returned back to us that is of that length with random numbers generated in it. Now, in order for us to use that custom method, we're going to need to create a custom instance of our class. So we'll go ahead and do a GP 8A, and we'll just call it my class, and that'll be an instance of our GP8A class. So now that we have that instance of the class, we can just go ahead down here, call our create array method using my class dot create array, and then pass a value to it. Let's go with just 5 to begin with here. That will create the array for us. And now let's add one more custom method here. We'll call it print array, and then that's going to accept our integer array. We'll just call that my array inside of here. Okay, so that's our method header. We'll go ahead and just grab this for loop that we created before that generates the output to the screen of an array. So we'll have to change this to my array dot length, and then here we're going to print my array dot I. And let's just go ahead and add a return. Each time we go through the loop, we just want to add a line feed. So now what we'll need to do is just create now a new array that we can take the results of our create array and store it in there. So we'll call it new array. And then we can use my class dot print array. And it'll print our new array. And we've got 5 there, so let's go ahead and run this. We should be able to get 5 output. There we did. We actually have an extra line feed. I guess we didn't need to have a line feed in there. Let's run it again. There we go. Okay, so that gives us 5. Now we just simply change this to a 10. Run it again. Now we get 10 randomly generated numbers. So we've got 2 custom methods now, one that creates an array based on the size that we submit to it, the argument value, when we call it. So right here, when we're calling it, we can put in any number we want, generate an array of any size. And then we have the print array, which takes an array of any size and simply prints out the values to the screen. So that essentially is your guided practice assignment. I do want to add one little wrinkle in it here. I want you to add a custom method called divisible by 10. And what it's going to do is count how many numbers in the integer array are divisible by 10. So you'll just add the call to that right after you print the array initially. So you'll have my class dot divisible by 10, and that will output only the values within that integer array that are divisible by 10. And count them also. We want to know how many of those are divisible by 10. And I know that's going to be challenging for you, so I will include the solution at the bottom of this video. Until next time, Happy coding! If you liked this video, please click the like button and leave us a comment down below. I also would appreciate it if you would subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, click the notification bell so that you'll be notified when new videos are posted.